Hey, hey, hey! Welcome back to Rock Doc's Reading Room. All right, where were we in my book, Rock Doc? I'm road manager for Edgar Winter's White Trash. I'm learning lessons as the days go on, and after a period of time, I'm ready to move on, and we'll hear about where I went and what I did next right now. Okay. I stayed with Edgar about a year. Learning how to be a good road manager was much more difficult than I had expected. It took a lot of attention to detail. This was in a day before computers and cell phones. You had to write everything down, and it was really difficult. Not as easy as it seemed, but I was getting the knack, and I got pretty good at it, and we'll see what happened. Okay. We weren't a very important band, especially at the beginning, and we played clubs, theaters, and even high schools. Many of the crowds were small, but we slowly built a loyal following. By the time I left, the band had national prominence. We parted ways amicably, and I began looking for a new job. One of the last things I did with Edgar was Edgar's band, White Trash and Edgar, were favorites of Bill Graham, who owned the Filmores. And when it was time for him to close the Filmore East, he personally invited the bands he wanted to perform that night, and Edgar was one of them. We were on tour in California and actually had to cancel a couple of gigs, but there was no way that we were going to miss that. And so we went, and I think it was us and Jay Giles, Albert King, and of course the Allman Brothers. And it was one of the most fantastic nights that I ever had in the music business, and I'll always be grateful to Edgar for the fact that I was working for him at that time. So at any rate, though, Edgar and I, parted ways, and that was okay, and I started looking for a new job. A lawyer I knew got me an interview with Dee Anthony, a well-known manager who was in need of an assistant. Dee had come up through the business. He was a really Italian guy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But he had started out working for Tony Bennett. And then he worked his way into rock and roll. Eventually, he was managing various artists, including Joe Cocker. And he was the one who put together Joe Cocker and Leon Russell and the Mad Dogs and the Englishmen tour. And there's a film about it that if you haven't seen, I strongly suggest you do. It's a very cool film. All right. So, Dee Anthony. Dee could have been a character in one of the Godfather movies. Born in the Bronx as Anthony Daddario, he was Italian through and through. Short and heavyset, with salt and pepper hair and a full beard. Dee managed Humble Pie, Peter Frampton, the Jay Giles Band, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He was extremely knowledgeable, well-respected, and rumored to be connected. Whether he was or not didn't matter. He was like Don Corleone to his groups, and they seemed to enjoy treating him that way. Dee and I hit it off immediately. When he asked about my family background, I told him that my father and uncle owned a trucking and warehousing company, and that as a kid, I often went to work with my father. He got a big kick out of the fact that I considered the shop stewards Dutch uncles. He hired me that day as a special assistant and began teaching me the business right away. So, having grown up in a family in the trucking and warehousing business. And of course, during the summers and on vacations, I would go in with my father and I'd work in the warehouse. And, I got to know the guys, and it was all Teamsters and longshoremen. And so, I didn't know them as anything but people who worked for my father. They were very nice to me. And, Dee got off on the fact that I had that relationship and that my father and uncle had been in that business and whatever. So he hired me. But he started to teach me, his ideas of the business immediately. He hired me actually initially to do box office, which meant that I went out on the road with his groups and collected the money. Now, back in the day, groups got paid in cash. There weren't these fancy bank transfers and all these other things. A group would get a down payment, a deposit, but then there were all these complicated deals depending on how many people would show up to the concert, somebody from the group had to go count ticket stubs and then actually take the cash. And that's what I did. I had a briefcase. Nobody knew who I was. That's how it was. So I got the job with Dee. And he started to teach me the business. And this is what he said. Neil, this is the most important lesson I can teach you. Number 1, get the money. Number 2, remember to get the money. Number 3, don't forget to always remember to get the money. And essentially, that's what I had to do, get the money. But I started to do a lot more because I had been a road manager. And, when I saw deficiencies in a tour that he had sent me on, I would pick up the slack. Okay. His groups were doing very well. Humble Pie's album, Rockin' the Filmore, was rising up the charts. A few months later, the boys in the band gave him a Silver Cloud Rolls Royce as a thank you. See? Stick with me, Dee said, looking at me. And you'll have a few of these by the time you get to be my age. I didn't really, but I did have a Rolls Royce when I lived in London working for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but that's another story. All right. Our relationship was close. That bode well for me, but there was one problem. The younger brother and partner, Bill, his younger brother and partner, Bill. The only thing I'll say about Bill is he always had the best-looking dry clean jeans and a year-round golden brown tan. Bill and I got along, but in the back of my mind, I knew that I could only go so far. Dee sent me on some East Coast tour dates with Humble Pie. But I got to talk about that. This was a rockin' band. I don't know how many of you got to see Humble Pie and got to see Steve Marriott, but this was a rock and roll band, man. And Steve Marriott was one of the best rock and roll frontmen that there were. And I'll tell you a little funny story about Steve. So I went on some East Coast dates. I think we definitely played a couple of dates on the Jersey Shore, then probably down maybe in Maryland, maybe Virginia. I don't know. And we got along great. I mean, I got along with the band. I got along with Steve. I partied with the band because they were definitely partiers. And mostly, though, I hung out with the road manager because I was interested in that. And it was a funny thing, man, because the guy had ulcers. Being a road manager, as I said before, was not an easy gig. And this guy, his suitcase was at least half filled with bottles of Pepto-Bismol. And he always had these stains on the side of his mouth. At any rate, Steve and I got along well. And during that period of time, I had an on and off girlfriend. And she had met him. And I found out a few weeks after the tour, I don't know if she came to visit me. I don't remember the circumstances. But I found out that he and her had a little thing. And I got really pissed off. And then about a week later, Dee sent me to go collect the money on a really big gig where Humble Pie, I think, headlined at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh. And I didn't want to go with the band. I didn't want to see him. I was pissed off. But of course, I had to go. I took a flight later, collected the money, and then went to see the band afterwards. And this is the kind of guy Steve Marriott was, He had found out subsequently, that she had been somewhat of my girlfriend, whatever. And as soon as he saw me walk into the dressing room, it was like, Neil, he was this little guy with super high energy. Oh, I'm so sorry, man. I didn't know. Come on, we're bros. He was really a great guy, incredible entertainer. And of course, I forgave him, It was no big deal to begin with. But those were the kinds of things that happened in those days. And Steve Marriott, man, I'll never forget him. Died much too young. At any rate. So Dee sent me on some East Coast tour dates with Humble Pie, and in March 1972 on the Emerson, Lake and Palmer U.S. tour. ELP had released Tarkus, their second album, about a year before. They were preparing their next album, Trilogy. ELP was big time and were very important to Dee. My primary job, as I said, was to do box office, collect the money, something I'd done as road manager for Edgar Winter. Groups were paid a guaranteed amount up front with a percentage of the gate to be paid in cash at the concert. In the days before computers, no one used bank transfers, and trust between parties was limited, as I had said. Someone representing the group would physically go to the box office during the show and count ticket stub, which is what I did. Now, ELP had their own tour manager, but he had his hands full with a large crew and the group's elaborate staging even back then before I joined them. And when Dee suggested that I go on the tour with them, even though it was an additional expense, the band was more than agreeable. Of course, Dee had a hidden agenda. He didn't want to go on the whole tour, and I could be his eyes and ears when he wasn't there. I hadn't been on a major tour with an A-list group, and I was psyched. It was time to take the next step in my music business education. So let me just finish off with Dee. You know, another of the really great things about working with Dee were the people he knew in the business. You know, he was really close with Bill Graham, and I got to be close with Bill Graham. He was really close with a guy named Frank Barcelona, who ran a talent agency called Premier Talent. And they were the booking agency back in those days. They did the Stones, they did Led Zeppelin, pretty much a lot of Atlantic record artists, but many others as well. And so for me, it was, you know, like a great education. You know, Dee treated me almost like the son he never had. And so, you know, back in those early days, you know, you could learn a lot, and a lot of things were going on, and it was just great to have been there. And like I said, humble pie, whew. after you stop watching this, go listen to a humble pie track. All right, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back again next Monday for another episode. And we're going to move on to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But, you know, it's not chronological. So I'll go back and tell an Edgar Winter story and maybe another story with Dee Anthony and whatever. All right, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you again next Monday for Rock Doc's Reading Room. And always remember, keep on rocking.